Hello and welcome to part 2 of my fine art series, which I have called Why. In this video I'll be sharing some of the decision making behind why I edit my fine art images the way that I do. If you're new to my channel, my name is Ben Harvey. I am a fully qualified architect, a photographer, and I also make videos here on YouTube covering a variety of topics, including landscape photography, gear reviews, and also architectural photography. Now, if you missed it, my first video in this series was called Where, which followed me capturing the images on location in London, as well as some quick before and after comparisons. In that video, I asked you, out of the 16 images that I shared, which would you like me to talk through in this video? And the votes are in. The top 3 images are Ghery 2, Walkies 2 and Domino 2. The third and final video in this series is called How, and I will take you through one image from start to finish, showing you my complete editing workflow. Okay, in my Photoshop I've got 3 images open, so let's have a quick look at these. The first one is Ghery 2, the second one is Walkies, and the third one is Domino. I'll tell you what, I'll talk you through Walkies first of all, and the reason it's called that is because this building's nickname is the Walkie Talkie building. If you don't know where that is and you haven't seen part 1 of my video yet, it's 20 Fenchurch Street in London, and it looks a bit like a walkie-talkie from a distance. And you can see, in order to achieve this composition, I was literally just stood by the side of the building, pointing the camera straight up, and you can almost see my composition right there. As you can see from the layers panel on Photoshop, it's pretty straightforward, okay? I've got the finished image on the top here, so if I switch that off, this is the converted black and white image. You can see it's very flat. And then if I switch that off, that's the original. That's got colour in it, believe it or not. This was such an overcast day, and I think that's a good segue to talk about sky replacement, because if you have a look at my final image, you'll see that I've replaced the sky. This is up to you whether you choose to replace skies. On that day, it was just blanket grey clouds, no interest at all. So if I had kept the sky, I might have been able to work with it, but I just decided in this instance, I'm just going to replace it with a more interesting sky. That's entirely personal preference. You can see here I've got a couple of branches and leaves coming into the frame. You could easily clone that out and keep the sky, but not on this occasion for me, thank you very much. People have asked me, Ben, whereabouts do you get your long exposure skies from? Quite simply, I've just stood out in my garden and photographed skies with long exposure filters when the conditions have been good, and then I've just got a whole catalogue of them, and then I just pick and choose which one is appropriate for whichever image. So that's the sky you can see in the final image. So what is a common theme throughout all of my images? I'm looking at this thinking, where do I want my audience to look? Okay, and I always want my audience to look somewhere in the middle, or broadly in the middle 50% of the image. So as you can see from this photograph, it's darker towards the edges and it's brighter in the middle of the frame. There is no focal point to this image as such, but you can see all of these leading lines are all drawing you towards the center of the image. In order to achieve that, I've had to make quite a few selections. So if I go over to my paths section, you'll see I selected the sky, and then I name all of my selections. So you can see here I've just referred to them as fins. So you've got fin 1, fin 2, fin 3, fin 4, and so on. And I've selected all 17 fins all the way down to just this tiny little fin over there. Now you might think, oh, why don't you just make one selection of all of the fins? The problem you'll run into is that if you want to create separation between fins 7, 8 and 9, if you batch selected them, then you can't achieve that. So I have personally made selections of every single fin so that I can create shadows and highlight differences between each of those fins, therefore creating a bit more depth. So whilst we're on the topic of the selections, you've already seen I had one selection for the sky, and I had one selection for all of the fins, and then I made a selection for the grills at the bottom. And the only remaining part of the photograph that's not a selection at the moment is the glazing. But then I could just use all of my existing selections, invert them, and then I get the remainder. So the editing workflow is quite straightforward. Look at the image, think, okay, which direction do I want the light to come from? I tend to work with the existing direction of light. So in this image, the light was coming in from this direction here. So I'm not going to fight that. I'm not going to try and get the shadows on the other side. And then I'm working with that. So generally, I'm having darker lines leading in the frame like so, everything is drawing my attention towards here. So I am selecting these grills, I'm using a gradient tool. I use the Artisan Pro panel, but you could use the gradient tool in Photoshop. We'll talk a lot more about the actual tools for editing in part 3 of the video. So you can see generally this is where the brightest part of the image is. It's not all the same distance from the edge of the frame. You can see here I've also applied a gradient to the glazing, because if you didn't, the glazing would end up being almost as bright, if not brighter, than this part up here. So you've got to make sure that you control every single element. I like to edit images and then step away from them, come back a couple of days later, definitely at least an hour, because sometimes you stare at an image a bit too long and you become a bit blind to it. I tend to use the whole, if you can like zoom out and look at the image on the thumbnail, clearly you can see when you look at this image nice and small, I've got all the tones and the highlights and the shadows exactly where I want them to be. And that is how I ended up with this final image. The next image I want to talk about is Domino, and I think it's quite self-explanatory why I've called it this. Tell you what is interesting about this image though. So I'll switch off the final edit. You can see how much noise there is in the background. Coming back to the fundamental question about whether or not you're comfortable replacing skies. What would you do in this instance if you didn't want to replace a sky? You could use slightly longer lens. It wouldn't have as much drama to it. You can go all the way around this building. However, there's construction all around this building. So I totally respect anybody out there that just says, no, I'm not going to replace the sky, but I would rather walk away with an image of this building and replace the sky. But just declare it, I'm happy to do so. So you can see here, this is the final edited image. That's the black and white image, and that's the color version. So you can see the building's got like a subtle bronzy color to it, but there is a lot of stuff going on in the background. Now, this is where this gets interesting, okay? Have a look at my selection. I've got one selection for the sky, and then if I load the selection, you can see here, I've got one for the building, which is quite simply the sky inverted. So I just made sure I zoomed in real close. Sometimes it's 400, 600%, and just use my Wacom tablet and my stylus and just trace around the building. Getting the sky selection is really important. What is very similar about all three of these images is that the buildings are not horizontal. There are two types of architectural photography from my experience. You either do horizontal and you use a tilt shift lens or a wide angle lens, and everything must be vertical. Alternatively, you can go completely skew and look up at a building, and you don't have to worry about perspective. You accept that there will be perspective, use a wide angle lens and get loads of drama in the shots. On that day, there was so much clutter around this building, then there's no way you could take a horizontal shot and have a nice clean image. That's what is similar about all three of these images. I am pointing the camera up in all of them. Now, Ben, why do you only have two selections for this image? Well, quite simply, it just has too many curves and it doesn't have any defined edges. So if I go back to the walkie-talkie building, this has got lovely, clean, sharp edges for me to make my selections to. So what do you do when you get a building that's curved like this? It's only really got one edge, and that's the edge of the building where it meets the sky. And then because I've got a direction of light coming in from the right-hand side here, I'm not going to fight that, I'm going to work with it. And this building, you could walk almost all the way around. So if you photographed it from that side, predominantly the building was in shade. If you photographed it from the right hand side, it's predominantly lit. If you come around to the side, it already had some shadows and some depth to it. So I'm just enhancing what was already there. I've got shadows here. This is the left hand side of this building is the darkest. And then I've got undulating waves of light and dark, light and dark. So when I thought, okay, how am I going to edit this? This was my immediate thought. Let's just emphasize the waves and the curves in this building using shadows and highlights. So if I go to my final edit, that's exactly what I've done. It's important, areas such as this where the building meets the sky, if this is too bright, it looks fake and like you've got a halo around the building. I deliberately kept in some of these highlights on the left hand side because otherwise the building starts to merge a bit with the sky. So you can see here, this is pretty much the brightest part of the image, then this is second, and then it's slowly waving in, and then I've got another hot spot here, got a little flourish of light here, and then it's gradually just feathered light coming up here. And without going too much into detail, how did you edit this, Ben? So if you think I've got one selection for the building itself, this is one selection. And then I use the Artisan Pro panel, and I would just make a cut in the selection so that I just had that part of it. And then I would use a gradient filter coming in from the right hand side, and then I would use the recovery tool. And then I do the same again. So I would select the building again, and then use this part of the building, delete that part of the selection, delete that part of the section, and then I'm kind of attacking it from the side with the light and shadows. And so that you don't end up with a sharp line, because you're creating a hard selection, but you don't want it to be a hard selection here because there's no edge to the building, I was then just recovering from the edges. So in a way, you don't have to make a selection of this building. You could just do kind of concentrated, soft edge selections and then add some highlights here. I chose to kind of start off with a selection of the building and then divide that up. There are loads of ways that you could do this, but this is how I decided to approach it. Once you've got these highlights, you just think, okay, well, I need some gradients here, I need some gradients here, I need to attack the building with some shadows where I don't want my audience to look so much. And that's the why about how I edited this image the way that I did. And I've saved the best till last. This was the image that got the most amount of votes. But I'll tell you a secret. I don't particularly like this image, and I think it's because I struggled so much with it. It was not an easy image. There was a load of selections to make, but that's not why I was struggling with it. I think I was struggling more in the editing part of it to get it kind of sculpted in the way that I want. So maybe I'm glad that you've said that you like this, because now I have to explain where I was struggling and why I edited it the way that I did. So you've got the original image here, there's a black and white conversion, and what you'll see is when you go to the edited version, if I create a duplicate of that to scribble over, you'll see I've got rid of the clutter that was on the roof. I thought that that was a bit distracting. Sometimes you kind of step back from a building and you don't see these tiny details. And then when you zoom into 400%, you see a handrail, and that's the time where you've got to make the decision. Am I going to keep the handrail in? If you're replacing the sky, that is. So if I go back to the original, there is a direction of light. The direction of light is coming from the left. Although it's very, very flat, it's as dull as can be. Again, this is a good starting position if you're looking to do a fine art edit, because if you had strong harsh light, the direction of light and the shadows are kind of dictated for you already, and it's a bit more difficult to unpick. So these are perfect conditions for fine art, but it forced me to replace the sky. Everything is a mid-tone grey, and I wasn't trying to expose for the sky, but I wanted to make sure that all of the details and the reflections in all of these windows were still there in the original RAW file. Let me show you the amount of selections I had to make for this image to be possible, okay? I've got the chimney there, I've got the sky, excluding the chimney. These twisting parts of the building are slightly grey. I decided to call that one, and then there was a grey part here. I'm not just making selections for the fun of it. I'm looking at this image thinking, okay, how can I create a bit of depth? So I'm going to need to select that. So I selected that, I called that grey 2, called that grey 3. I didn't just select that all in one big lump either. Every single, let's just call them pods, these projecting pods, I wanted to separate from the pod below it. So that was 1C, I think, then that was 1B, that was 1A. You can imagine when you look at this image, you think, oh no, this is never ending. Got another grey section there, another grey section there, and it goes on and on and on. So I made selections for every single grey twisted part of projecting bays. You're then left with all of the white bits in between. And again, this is a curved elevation. That's one elevation, and you want to create difference between that and the white curved elevation that's next to it. So when you go to the final image, you can see how I had to create so many different selections in order to create separation. If I didn't make these selections, I wouldn't be able to separate out that from that because it was the same tone of grey. The same here again, that is darker than that. So I'm saying the light is coming from the left. You can see here, this is the brightest part. I chose for the light to come in here. However, when I edited this too dark, the left hand side became way too heavy because I had light over here, bright contrasty bits to the bays over here, brightness over here, and then all of this was just dark. So what I did to be a bit playful with the truth, but could happen in reality, this is where it's at its brightest, and I decided to be a bit playful with the truth and have light bouncing back to create a bit of light over here. Just a spot, just enough so that it didn't become too dark and too heavy. And with the chimney stack as well, it's all the same tone, even though there is light coming from the left-hand side. If you go to the final edit, you can see I've enhanced the light on the left-hand side, but it's consistent with the rest of the image. And then I've got shadows, quite strong shadows on the right-hand side. I did have to be very careful with the bays on the left-hand side because if you make these too bright, the viewer would be drawn to the left-hand side of the image, and it's very close to the edge of the frame. So I'm always trying to pick the points of highest contrast to be somewhere in the center of the frame. So there you go, that was the final image. When I made it, obviously I published it, so I must be happy with it to a certain extent. But out of all the 16 images, interestingly, that was my least favorite, and that was the one that got the most amount of votes. Fascinating. So just before I end this, let me show you the amount of selections. So grey 1 was this bay here, and then, wow. I reckon there might be about 50 plus selections on this. Some people are going to look at this and think, Ben, I'm out. I thought you said this was going to be easy. This is why I saved this image until last. I say this is a very, very difficult image, and unless you've done loads of fine art images, I probably wouldn't take on an image like this. Whereas if you go to something like the walkie-talkie building, I'd say that was fun, that was pleasure to work on. And then Domino, again, if you know your way around Photoshop and the different tools available, this is actually pretty easy as well. And I just want to say thank you to everybody that voted for their favourites, enabling me to continue this series, because if nobody voted, I wouldn't know exactly which images were your favourites. I hope that this behind the scenes was helpful for anyone looking to create fine art images, and hopefully confirm that it's not as difficult as you might think. Let me know which one image you'd like me to show you the complete editing process from start to finish in part 3 of this series. If you haven't seen part 1, then make sure that you watch this video next, and when part 3 is available, I'll put a link here. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Let me know if you've got any comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video.